obviously your new podcast, you've been contacted by someone who claims to have new information about this. Is that unusual with these sorts of cases, that over time people will start to come forward with new information?
You know, that's really the value of, I think, the true crime community and the visit that law enforcement gives to these cold cases, why it's so important that cold case units exist to kind of breathe new life back into cases that are old. In my experience, what happens is people over the course of time gain the courage to step forward when they may have not have had it then. In this particular instance, this now 70-year-old man was a young boy at the time, and he didn't have the courage to step up and say, I believe my father killed Betty Shanks. He lived with that throughout his life, and through a series of things that he did to corroborate what he believed, he came up with a pretty compelling story. But it happens over and over again. We see people who maybe after they leave an abusive marriage or relationship get the courage to step up and say, this is what happened 20 years ago, or that a child, after they mature and become adults themselves, get the courage to step up and say, I was victimized, or I witnessed this as a child. Or it may boil down to just simply that forensics is advanced to a point that we can go back and look at old cases through familial DNA or through other kinds of processes and breathe new life into the case. And so a combination of all of that really has been exciting for the cold case industry, and to families who have spent a lifetime wondering if their case would ever be solved. There's still hope.
Well, I mean, speaking of spending lifetimes hoping that this case would be solved, there's been so many theories over the years put forward by people like yourself, local historians, journalists. I want to just go through some of those from the early days. There was, initially, it was a crime that just shocked everyone. We hadn't had anything like that really in Brisbane, and nothing since that's been unsolved like this in such a brutal fashion. What about this case captivated everyone? I mean, it just drew people in, didn't it?
Well, yeah, and it's everyone. It's everyone who sits in middle class Australia. It's every family's nightmare that their daughter is suddenly taken from them and murdered. It's everyone's fear and nightmare that walking down the street, the boogeyman or the predator that's lurking in the shadows comes out and actually commits this crime. And so when we say it gripped the community, not unlike any other community around the world, that all of a sudden changes from being somewhat naive and feeling like I can leave my doors open at night to realizing that there are evil predators out there who would invade that special space.
And I mean, initially, like I said, there were so many theories. What were some of the initial things that police and even just the community? I mean, there was a doctor that people thought might have been involved. How did that come about?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes we're talking about the old game with the doctor, the baker, the candlestick maker. This is the perfect scenario where there was a physician, and the physician was tied to Betty Shanks through kind of some shoestring attempts. There were other unique characteristics about that physician, and more importantly, there was timing, and the timing really upset a lot of people. But I think as law enforcement looked into that case, they had to explore that as a possibility. But as they looked at the evidence from the case, they looked at the individual, the relationships, because it's really important in these cases where we see such personal behavior happening that we understand what the relationship was between the victim and the suspect. And we can only do that when we look at what we call victimology, or understanding who this person is that's victimized, and suspectology, who these pool of suspects are. And as they went through that evidence, I think law enforcement was pretty comfortable in saying, now we can weed out the doctor. So then we go to some of the other theories. We talk about Sterry and all of the effort that's been put into Sterry and whether he's probable or a possible suspect. again, absolutely a possible suspect. And the work that Ted did on his investigation into this is just, I just can't do anything but compliment him for the dogged determination that he showed as he went through that, with the influence that this suspect's family member had to pursue this and continue to bring it to the front. So you start again. I personally look at the victimology and the suspectology and the probability, not the possibility, but the probability that these two were having some kind of a relationship. And these always become really challenging, Matthew, because what we see is that the victim may not think there's a relationship with the predator, but a predator who's stalking and fantasizing and window peeking believes there is a relationship. And so it becomes really incumbent on law enforcement. And this is where profiling becomes so important in looking at the behaviors to really determine, is that relationship legitimate? Would a Betty Shanks want to be in a relationship with the locksmith? And we'll never know, because the locksmith, I don't believe, was ever interviewed by law enforcement. So is it
just
possible?
On talking about the locksmith, I mean, just to provide a bit of context, he had been hired by Betty a few months beforehand. And then it was his daughter who came forward after Betty was found 10 years afterwards. What evidence? I mean, she had some pretty compelling stuff. What did she have to say to police when it happened?
Well, so some of which still is locked in police files, but there was implications of a relationship there. And so that really kind of changes the dynamic a little. And that's why we look at behavior, because if there was a relationship, does it make sense that Betty, in a completely different socioeconomic group, completely different goals in her life, progressing well in the university, potential opportunities to go to work for the government, does it make sense that she would be having a relationship or an affair with an older guy who's a blue collar worker, who's kind of dead end with a family, and all of the baggage that comes with these people who are trying to live split or dual lifestyles? Does it make sense? And so for me, it was pretty easy to say it's less probable that he would be one who's responsible for this. And again, the real challenge is, without an interview and understanding what those relationships were at the time, it becomes difficult. Now, on the possibility side, you have to always consider the fact that, again, there are lots of predators who create a fantasy in their mind, create a relationship in their mind. And to this predator, if he was the predator, he could have attacked Betty with this fantasy fueled drive, realizing that it was all falling apart, and then of course it leads to murder. But I don't believe it's probable in this particular case.
I mean, I get whichever theory we look at, she was attacked as she walked home, right? And a lot of the other theories that came out, some people reported also, which you discuss in your podcast, that there was a man in a brown coat seen. A number of people around the area, taxi drivers, throughout that night saw this man. Is he linked to this new theory of yours that you've got?
Absolutely. I mean, this is like not only this incredible murder mystery, but it's this kind of like who done it and who's the guy in the brown suit. And I suspect there were a lot of brown suits that disappeared after this thing happened. But we have to go back and we have to look at too, what's the likelihood of all of these suspects having a brown suit? Was the brown suit really tied to the death of Betty Shanks, or was it a red herring? And I kind of lean toward the fact that it was in fact tied to the suspect who was in this case. Again, why is a guy hanging out at the Grange terminus at that hour of the night? It's not a destination spot. It's not a place where people go to tour. Sure, there are certain pubs that happen to be in the neighborhood, just like every other little neighborhood, a little stopping place to get the little watering hole. But why is this guy stuck at the train station? Why is he passing up opportunities for rides home? Why is he appearing like he's frustrated? That is all of an indication of somebody who is waiting for something specific.
And so this person who's come forward now and said, I think my dad did it. What evidence does he have that, I mean, do you think that it's a feasible theory, or is it more someone's just contacted you and said it? Because I mean, there have been confessions over the years from people police have deemed definitely didn't do it. Is this maybe one of those?
Yeah, in every high profile case, you have people who step up and claim responsibility. I think about this. Could you imagine having such a mundane life that claiming responsibility just to get fame, claiming responsibility of murdering someone would make sense in your wacky mind? And to this, in this particular case, and in many high profile cases, people step up and confess to cases. And that's why it's so important also that law enforcement keeps certain pieces of information kind of tucked away in the vault, so to speak, so that they can corroborate and tie back to the case. That's why it's so important that 2 years ago, when this came to our attention, that we turned it over to Queensland Police in hopes that they had files still in the basement about this case that hadn't deteriorated or been destroyed, or something happened to them and they were lost, because there has to be pieces of information in there that only an offender could be able to talk to, or someone who had talked to the offender, like in this case, which happened quite remarkably, I might say. I was in Australia. I was on ABC talking about something, and they brought up the Betty Shanks case. And I was a little bit blindsided by the investigation. So I threw out some basic profiling principles to kind of answer the question. And at the end, I said that what I said to you early on in this, and that is that over time, people get the courage to step up and share information that maybe they didn't have the courage earlier in their life to do. Well, as I boarded a plane in Sydney to fly back to Los Angeles, I had no expectation that anything other than that television interview would hit the airwaves and this thing would be over. As I stepped off the plane and turned on my phone, the first message that I had was from a man who said, "I was a boy and my father killed Betty Shanks." And that was a result of listening to that interview, which led us to talk about the evidence that he had, the memories that he had, but most importantly, the geographic lay of the land as he laid it out. And as we put it together, it made as good a sense as any other theory that we've heard out there. In fact, enough sense that as an investigator who spent decades in this business, I was really compelled and felt like we needed to forward that on to police.
And I mean, so what evidence did this man have that his father was responsible?
Well, no, first and foremost, you're going to have to listen to the podcast in order to get that. But know that there was eyewitness testimony involved in this case, that there was physical evidence that was involved in this case. There was photographs from then and now, and then actual conversation, not confession necessarily, but admissions, which are really interesting when you look at criminal cases. And in totality, just weighed heavy enough that it made really good sense. And we felt like it had to be presented as one more theory in what may have possibly been the cause of Betty Shanks' death. I hope that it leads to the closure of Betty Shanks' case. And frankly, I hope that this young man gets the reward that, or this young man, this old man who was a young man then, gets the reward, because imagine the courage that took to stand up and say, my father killed Betty Shanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said there you hope he gets the reward. You clearly are fairly confident that this might be on the right track here.
Well, depending on what police can corroborate, and hopefully, again, I say, hopefully, those case files weren't destroyed over time. I know that at one point there were some media reports suggesting that there was some forensic examination of family members to the doctor compared to evidence found on Betty Shanks. Well, I'm kind of questioning that and wondering, when did that occur? What was that forensic evidence? How was it maintained for 70 years to be credible enough to do familial DNA testing against, or other kinds of things? So there are just probably so many unanswered questions that's why it really rolls back to it. The goal of this podcast, of all podcasts, I hope, in the true crime community, are to raise awareness and get information to people that have the authority to investigate, to weigh, and then to make charges, and or to close cases. And so that's really what would be a successful podcast, is if it led police to either exclude or focus on one more potential suspect in this case.
70th anniversary lines up pretty well, obviously. Hopefully that might coax someone further forward as well to come up with something new.
I hope so. And you know what I really hope is that it helps, for instance, in this particular case, and the person that we believe needs very deep consideration, that 80-year-old man now, who's carried this burden his entire life, can finally feel like he's been able to get it off and make it available. And that takes an incredible amount of courage. I salute him every time I talk to him. And I can't imagine how difficult that would be. And I want everyone out there to think about that. Imagine taking someone you love, and you know what? It doesn't matter whether a parent is abusive or not. Kids don't know the difference. They love their moms and dads. Imagine having the courage to step up and say, I think my father killed Betty Shanks.